Wait a little longer. Okay, I guess we will start. And hello, everybody. My name is Hakan Özoğlu. I'm a professor of history and the director of Middle Eastern Studies at University of Central Florida. I would like to welcome you to our discussion on the Kurds. And first of all, I'd like to thank Professor Güneş Murat Tezcür for his initiative, who is, among many hats, is the director of Kurdish political studies at the University of Central Florida, for organizing. And we have two speakers. The first one is David McDowall, the writer of a very influential book that we all use. Anyone who has any interest in Kurdish studies probably knows the book. Now, if you don't know him, you will probably see his face now, or you are seeing it, hopefully. Very humble gentleman who has a lot to say. And Professor David Romano will also have some remarks. The format will be, we're trying to make it as interactive as possible. So we'll have each speaker have 15 minutes or so opening remarks, and then we will open it for discussions. But beforehand, let me very briefly introduce David McDowall, who studied Middle Eastern history. He was a fellow historian, actually. There are not very many historians in this group, usually. And he studied under a very renowned scholar, Albert Hourani. But he pursued a non-academic, in fact, much more interesting career, who was in the British Army. He also was in the British Consul and the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. As you can see, he has many diverse interests and publications. He was also an Oxfam relief worker in Beirut, which is a very interesting place. Perhaps we can talk about that too, and the Kurds in that area during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. In 1984, he turned into full-time writing, which is a blessing for many of us. And he has written on Lebanon, Palestine, and Britain, as well as on Kurdistan and the Kurds. The subject of Kurds are obviously, anyone who is in this panel knows it's extremely important and long neglected subject of Middle Eastern studies. And we're all grateful for any scholarly publications on that subject. Other speaker is Professor David Romano. He holds the Thomas G. Strong Chair in Middle Eastern Politics at Missouri State University. He received his Ph.D. from University of Toronto and his MA and BA from McGill University. He has many publications. He's the author of Kurdish Nationalist Movement that came out of Cambridge University Press in 2006, which is translated into Turkish and Persian. Also the co-editor of Conflict, Democratization, and the Kurdish Issue in the Middle East, and the Kurds in the Middle East, Enduring Problems and New Dynamics. So without further ado, let me turn floor to David McDowall.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending. As you will all know, the fourth edition of my book, A Modern History of the Kurds, appeared in April. And I hope it will be useful to you. I mean, I think reviewing it, I mean, it's a very, in a sense, traditional approach, but it seemed to me that the first thing that any serious student of the Kurds and Kurdistan must do is to get a grasp of the broad chronology of events, what things have happened, how and why they've happened. And I've tried to answer those questions, but in narrative form, and I hope in a readable form. I mean, if you look at Kurdistan today and you ask yourself, where are these Kurds in terms of what progress have they made, what has been their journey or several journeys, then you do have to look at their history, and certain fundamental questions come up. And one is one that we all face in life. what is your identity? And I'm prepared to bet that each of you, like myself, in different contexts, comes up with, I am a, whatever it might be. And it is only when I am meeting people who are not British that I probably would say I'm British. In other contexts, I might say something else. I might be a football fan. I might be very religious. I might feel strongly about the class or my ethnicity, racial ethnicity, rather than necessarily a nationality. So there are a whole string of different identities we have. And I think for Kurds, it's a particularly complicated issue, partly because, of course, they are, all of them, in states which are not Kurdish, essentially Kurdish. They have large Kurdish minorities, but they are all purport to be something else. So this immediately unleashes a question. But there are so many other things that have been critical to the journeys that Kurds have made, both individually and as a community, in terms of religion, in terms of whether they are urban, whether they've grown up in a town or a city, or whether they've grown up in the countryside. And there are a whole string of issues like that which have affected the way that they have formed their identity. And you could bring together two Kurds who were both claimed to be Kurdish, but who had really extraordinarily disparate other identifying features, if you like, of the way that they live their lives. One might be Alawi, another one might be a very hardline Sunni, or one will be working on the land, and another will be a scholar. So we all have these varieties, but I think the Kurds have these dilemmas in perhaps to a more acute degree, because they are like many peoples in the world. I think those of us who have settled identities are probably privileged, but there are many peoples in the world for whom the question of identity is a very difficult and pressing issue which assails them every day. And I would immediately say that that must be true for migrant people who find themselves in a different culture, having to adjust to it and having to ask themselves fundamental questions. And of course, in the case of Kurdistan, I would say that there are two, I think, new issues which have really grown to prominence in the last, over the last generation. And one is the question of gender, which I think very few people talked about 25 years ago. And the other question is that of generation, of age. And we see in Kurdistan, for example, that we sense a restiveness amongst young people at how their elders have handled the question of being Kurdish. And then, of course, the questions to do with the relationship of Kurds with the outside world. And it's the scholar Boris James who's coined this, I think, very good word, in-betweenness, which is, again, a major dilemma for Kurds. They are sandwiched and permanently sandwiched between more powerful cultures and polities. And they have been so since the Middle Ages. And this, of course, lies at the very heart of their political destiny. How do they handle being sandwiched between more powerful neighbors? And that, I suppose, really brings one on to the question of how they've handled the 20th century in particular, and the growth of the national movement amongst Kurdish people. And of course, that's led to real dilemmas. some Kurds, as you are all aware, have simply accepted complete integration into the life, the mainstream life of the state that they live in. And others have been bitterly divided between what one might call the autonomists, people who want a self-government, but nevertheless accept that they would be under a different flag than perhaps a Kurdish one, and those who want full secession and independence. And we have a somewhat ironical situation at the moment where the Kurds of Iraq want independence, but have got autonomy, and Kurds elsewhere who, well, temporarily have autonomy in northeast Syria, but I suspect it's very temporary. And elsewhere, they've been deeply frustrated even in that journey. So there's the other thing, I think, issue that one can usefully think about is that the Kurds are perhaps the most significant and largest sub-state actor in the region. And that creates a whole lot of questions as to how they should act. And it makes them extremely vulnerable to the great powers who wish, and indeed regional powers, who wish to use sub-state actors for their own political purpose. I think I'd better stop on that note and leave it to someone else to talk for a few minutes.
Before I turn to David Romano, I forgot to mention that for the discussions, if you have any questions, please pose it to the chat box, and also direct your question to any of the speakers. And then after that, we will collect it and we will pose those questions to our speakers. Let me turn to David Romano. It's your turn, David.
Thank you, and thank you to the University of Central Florida and Jalal Talabani Chair in Kurdish Politics for inviting me to this Zoom event and to comment on the latest edition of David McDowall's book. I'm really honored to do so and to share with you a few remarks regarding this wonderful book, A Modern History of the Kurds. The first edition of this book was really, really important for me when I began my doctoral thesis at the University of Toronto in 1995. After spending time in Bakur and Bashur in 1994, I returned to Canada wanting to start a PhD in order to focus my future studies on Kurdish issues. Now, when I went to the University of Toronto's library shortly after arriving there in the fall of '95 to see what books they had on the modern Kurds, this was, I guess, back in the days when we actually went to libraries in person, there were very, very few. With more than 2.5 million books at the time, the University of Toronto had the largest collection in all of Canada. For the Kurds, that meant only 6 books, 3 in English and 3 in French. Now, the books I found then were in 1995 were good. If I remember correctly, they were Robert Olson's The Emergence of Kurdish Nationalism and the Sheikh Said Rebellion, Martin van Brunessen's Aga, Sheikh and State, Philip Kryenbroek and Stefan Spurl's The Kurds, A Contemporary Overview, Chris Kuchera's Le Défi Kurde, Gérald Chalian's Les Kurdes et le Kurdistan, and Ismet Sharif Vanli's Le Kurdistan Irakien, Entité Nationale. Needless to say, 6 books available on the modern Kurds was not enough. Luckily for all of us, in the years immediately following 1995, a number of additional works on the Kurds came out, or earlier works such as Jawade's The Kurdish National Movement became available to us. Of these, I have to say that David McDowall's was the most comprehensive and helpful for me. I cited his work a great deal in my doctoral thesis and the 2006 book with Cambridge University Press that came of it. What I really appreciate from David McDowall's book is not just the vast amount of material he covers in it, but a style of narrating the history and politics of the Kurds that is not only well-sourced, but also clear, organized, and full of compelling, well-reasoned analysis. So again, this book, when it first came out, was truly a godsend for me. In my own work at the time, I was trying to fit the Kurdish case into various social movement theories. And David's account of various episodes in Kurdish history allowed me to see much better how I might do that. I remember I used to read the first edition of his book in the mornings outside by a lake near where my mother lived in Quebec, busily writing in the margins in pencil. I don't write in pen in the margins, as his accounts sparked various ideas in my head. And then in the evening, I would go and work on my thesis. As a result, I'm forever indebted to his work on the Kurds. That much said, the most recent updates to a modern history of the Kurds nicely address some of the gaps that existed in the book before. Nothing is perfect, of course. Everything we always do is a work in progress. So it was with great pleasure that I saw the fourth edition's new sections on Rojava, Northeast Syria, on gender, and on Islam, for instance, as well as discussion of new events of the 21st century, of the first 20 years of the 21st century. This more than ever makes David's book one that I regularly recommend to everyone, and I hope during the Q&A session, we can address many of the updates to the book. I would be particularly interested in hearing David's views regarding how Kurds might overcome the difficult geographic, class, political, social, and cultural circumstances that continue to divide them, to darken their future prospects, and make self-determination either a still distant dream, as in Turkey and Iran, or a tenuous and problematic reality, as in Syria and Iraq. From the updated sections of his book and the afterward section, it seems to me that David feels the way forward for Kurds revolves around civic activism rather than armed struggle, and that such activism might best be civic and political activism, I should say, and that such activism might best be based on a sense of shared ethnic identity rather than kinship, which he sometimes equates with tribalism, rather than nationalism, which has been the problem of the states that Kurds have been in conflict with, and rather than a utopian so-called democratic autonomy project, which does not always look so politically liberal in practice so far. If I'm wrong on this, I of course invite David to correct me. If I'm right on this assessment of his thinking on the matter, I would love to hear a bit more from him regarding what this civic and political activism might look like in the various Kurdistans in the future. Before we get into the Q&A, however, I want to also ask a question of David and to venture part of my own answer to that question. The question is, as outsiders and non-Kurds, what is our role in contributing to scholarship on the Kurds? We do have clear handicaps in understanding the Kurdish reality and lived experience of Kurds. How does one compensate for these handicaps to still make a useful contribution to Kurdish studies? At best, an outsider might have easier access to some interviews or archives, particularly regarding state archives or state officials in places like Turkey or Iran or abroad. They might have easier access than someone from the region, whom people immediately try to situate within various loyalty groups or competing parties. At worst, outsiders such as ourselves never understand things with the level of detail and nuance that many born in Kurdistan enjoy. So I want to venture part of the answer to this question and then invite David to share his thoughts on the issue. First, I think this book and its latest edition is the best evidence of what outsiders can contribute. Good research and as many interviews as possible, organized into a coherent and compelling analysis, goes a very long way to advancing knowledge about anything. This is true no matter who does it, whether an outsider or someone from the region. So in this sense, I think outsiders, as long as they are not displacing or speaking over various voices from Kurdistan, have a lot to contribute. Some 30 years ago, when I began studying the history and politics of Kurdistan, I would say that there were not enough Kurdish voices explaining their own history and politics and culture to the rest of the world. There weren't enough voices at all doing so. I was lucky to study under one of the few available Kurdish voices in the West at that time, which was Amir Hassanpour. Today, the situation has thankfully changed, with a very vibrant new generation of scholars from Kurdistan in the mix now. Although for this particular webinar Zoom event, you're mainly stuck with the two Davids from the West, I'm afraid, but I know that UCF holds many other events where Kurdish voices are front and center. Also, perhaps 30 years ago, someone might have said that an outsider can be more objective towards their subject matter, but I think advances in the philosophy of science and such have convincingly shown that none of us are objective. We all come to our subject matter with an array of emotional, situational, and ideational baggage. When it comes to deploying theory or research methods, outsiders also, of course, have no special advantages over people from Kurdistan. But just as travelers look at their surroundings with different eyes than those who are at home, perhaps so too with scholarship on the Kurds. An outsider can offer different lenses, not better or more accurate lenses necessarily, but just different ones with which to view things. And in the infinitely complex world of human social relations, I would say the more different lenses we can rely upon, the better. So by way of example, while I was still living in my native Montreal and doing a postdoc there, I had a Kurdish woman from Ahmed or Diyarbakir move in with me to share rent in our apartment. I looked forward to learning more about Kurdistan from her, which I did, of course, but to my surprise, I learned the most about Canada from her. As an outsider who had studied and learned about Canada, she didn't take things for granted and looked at everything with a fresh pair of eyes. She questioned basic assumptions about my homeland in a way I would not always have done on my own. So I guess what I would want to hear from David as a fellow outsider, not from Kurdistan, is how he came to his passion for studying the Kurds and how he feels his role is in this, including his limitations as well as any especially useful skills that have helped him produce such good work on the history of the Kurds.
I guess the best thing to do right now is to turn the floor to David McDowall to respond to these questions, and then we turn it to the floor.
Well, David, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for your very kind and flattering words. I feel unworthy of the honors you've given me, but there was nothing I think I could disagree with. I think you've made some very interesting and important points. All of us, simply because we're humans, let alone whether we are Kurds or any other ethnic or national group, all of us are deeply flawed people. That's the nature of what we are as humans. And trying to write, I can tell you, I mean, 25 years ago, I had to spend quite a lot of time writing reports for use in British courts with regard to Kurdish asylum seekers from Turkey. And I was required to put an affirmation at the beginning of my report that what I said was true. And I declined to do so, much to the irritation of the courts. But I said I couldn't tell them that it was true. All I could tell them was that I think what I'm saying is true according to my own experience and the objective facts about which I know. And this is the real dilemma for every historian, is that you you bring to your work, and that's the value and fascination of history as well. You bring to your work not only facts that might be agreed amongst a large group of people, but you also bring to your work your life experience, what you yourself thinks is true of the way human beings behave. And we're all going to disagree about that to some extent, and we're going to agree about it to another extent. And this is the dilemma of every historian, but it's also why when you read a history written in the 19th century, it seems a bit clunky, and why history constantly needs to be rewritten. And then, of course, my baggage, my father was born, in fact, this will surprise you all, he was born in the 19th century. And he was an imperialist, and I can remember him. He strongly supported Britain in its attack on Egypt in 1956. And he believed that Britain was losing its empire and its place in the world. And he was deeply depressed by that. Well, I don't share those views at all, but nevertheless, I was conditioned to some extent, although I've kind of rationally repudiated many of the views of my upbringing. Nevertheless, I know that I carry all this baggage, British greatness. I use the British archives as the basis for my book. And I knew I was reading about events in the Middle East through an imperialist prism. Well, you adjust for that if you're trying to reach the truth, but at the same time, you know that is a danger, that you fail to do so adequately, and other people will come along and challenge what one writes, and that's as it should be. I have no problem about writing about the Middle East, and even if I do not myself belong to the Middle East, I think this is a really important contemporary issue. People get very sensitive. My wife writes for young readers, and she writes fiction for young readers. She's acutely sensitive of the difficulties of writing and putting yourself in the shoes of someone else. But at the same time, I think it's a perfectly valid thing to do. Let it be shot down. We have open debate. We write what we think is the truth. Other people of any ethnicity can challenge it and demonstrate why it is ill-founded. That's how it should be. I can remember 20 years ago, I think I was in the HADEP pro-Kurdish party office in Adana, and a young Kurd came up to me when he realized I was a writer, and he said, "Why are not all British writers writing about the Kurds? It's their duty to write about our human rights situation." And I said to him, it's not their duty. Their only duty is to write what they feel they can usefully or wish to write about. That is their calling, and you can't order people to write other stuff. So there was somebody who was expecting every Brit, even if he didn't know much about Kurdistan, to inveigh about the human rights situation in Kurdistan. And I say that because, you know, we're caught between people, some people who might say someone who's not Kurdish has no right to write about the Kurds, and another one who says you must write about the Kurds. And the trouble with the former argument, which leads into things like accusations of cultural appropriation, is that if you take this argument logically, I cannot write about somebody else who is of my own nationality, but belongs to another religion, another class, another ethnic group. You know, and in the end, the logical sequence of that is all you can write about is yourself, and no one else is allowed to write about yourself at all. You know, it's a kind of crazy, the logic just goes completely overboard. So I think it's a good thing that people will write, and I greatly welcome when non-British people write about Britain. For me, it is absolutely fascinating. They see things with a clarity I don't see, and I welcome it. So I hope that's a sufficient response.
Professor Romano, you asked a number of questions. Did Mr. McDowall miss any?
Oh, well, the other thing I was hoping we would address in Q&A, although perhaps some of the audience wants to rephrase it in different ways, was basically this endemic question of which way forward for Kurdish groups. Is it civic and political activism, or how do they get beyond the numerous identity and other issues dividing them? If we all agree that they share a goal of more self-determination to have a bigger role in determining their own presence and futures, what's their best way forward?
Well, if I could just say a few things about that, Kurds obviously themselves have to decide what they want. What strikes me as certainly in Turkey as the most useful thing that Kurds can do is to build coalitions with liberal-minded Turks. And they need that electorally, and I think they need it in terms of helping Turks to see that Kurds don't have to be a threat in any sense, and that actually there is a win-win opportunity for the whole of Turkey. I mean, it's one of the things that's the biggest, for me, the biggest puzzle is the way that the Turkish state has wasted a phenomenal opportunity in Eastern Turkey ever since the establishment of the Republic. I simply don't understand it. I don't understand how this ideology has not been manifestly catastrophic and why it has not been vigorously challenged, but it hasn't. So I think that building of a relationship across the country, across the Turkish state is immensely important for Kurds to acquire the kind of electoral strength and acceptability. I think in Iraq, I personally have misgivings about the way that many Kurds, I think, have turned their back on Arab Iraq. And of course, Kurds have very good reasons for being extremely angry and embittered by the behavior they've had from Arab Iraq. But the brutal truth is that Iraqi Kurds are fated to live with Iraqi Arabs come what may. They are their neighbors. And we all have we can have difficulty with our neighbors, but we learn that a productive relationship and a civil relationship is fundamental to getting what you want, is understanding what your neighbor wants and working with the grain of that if you possibly can. And it seems to me that not every Kurd in Iraqi Kurdistan has felt that way. I think it's particularly unfortunate that Arabic is being lost in Iraqi Kurdistan. It seems to me that's an important skill for maintaining a productive relationship. About Syria, I could say, I think almost nothing, because the future, I think, is going to be very difficult. Clearly, with a state that has the habit of such highly centralized authoritarian power, it is very, very difficult to create local space in order to express your own identity and to function in an administrative way, not let alone political, without the heavy-handedness of the state. So I would like to think that obviously that the Kurds of Syria could acquire autonomy, but I think it's extraordinarily unlikely and improbable. And as for Iran, I see no prospects at all even in the long term, I'm afraid.
Thank you. The floor is open for questions. Please do write your questions in the chat box, and then I will read it to your intended person. I think there is a question here that it says, could either David talk a little more about how Kurdish youth view the way their elders have navigated these issues of identity and politics?
Well, I would invite the elder David to start.
Hakan, if you could just repeat that question. And
yes. It says, could either David talk a little more about how Kurdish youth view the way their elders have navigated these issues of identity and politics?
Wow. Well, as you can see, I'm still in the prime of my youth and therefore well qualified. I think there's a real difficulty. I mean, I have very much in mind the catastrophe in the Kurdish cities of the southeast in 2015, when youth took it into their hands to decide to administer the cities and to resist Turkish police and armed forces. And it's led to a very major setback. On the other hand, there is this dilemma of an aging Kurdish leadership. And I just don't know what the answer is, but we've seen across the Middle East that it is essentially, I mean, when one speaks of the uprisings in the Arab world from 2011, it was largely young people who led it. And there is clearly, I sense a major frustration among young people across the whole region. I don't think I'm in any position to suggest what they should do. I mean, this is something that they have to work out. But I do think that the question of respect for the older generation is now under some question from young people who feel that they've been kept silent.
I think it varies a great deal. So I'm also a little uncomfortable trying to generalize an answer there, but I guess I've spent the most time in Bashur in Iraqi Kurdistan in the last couple of years. And over there, I sensed a huge amount of frustration within the youth that, you know, they've grown up. So if we're talking youth, many of them have known nothing but the post-Saddam era there, if they're in their 20s. And the sense I got was a feeling that the older political leadership in Bashur had kind of tainted Kurdish nationalism by diverting it into family politics and feeling that only their family could be trusted to represent the Kurdish nation and so forth, and then botching it in many ways. Not every way, like, I mean, some of the youth are thankful for some of the good things that have occurred for Iraqi Kurdistan, but there's a large sense of disappointment that they have a more wide-ranging national view than a lot of their leaders seem to have, and they're disappointed. And I guess in Iranian Kurdistan, they would be especially disappointed about the impotence of the older generation. And if you want to talk about divisions amongst Kurdish groups, the divisions amongst the Iranian Kurdish, the Rojavati political parties, are even make the ones in Bashur pale in comparison. So I think there's a lot of frustration about the impotence, but that's not really all the fault of Rojavati leadership. They have an impossible situation in Iran. So it's a difficult situation. But I think for the youth perspective, to me, the most interesting thing is disappointment in Bashur. And I think the leadership in Bashur and Hawler needs to turn a different page and get beyond the neo-patrimonial politics quickly, or else they're going to have a youth bulge and problem on their hands.
Thank you. Let me move on to the next question. It says, to have a retrospective perspective, how would McDowall evaluate the evolving prospects of Kurdish sovereignty now as compared to the publication of the first edition in 1994?
Well, massive events have taken place. I think, I mean, clearly, both in Iraq and Syria, really quite earth-shattering events have taken place, relatively happy ones in Iraq, but I completely agree with, I mean, for Iraqi Kurds, that they now have formalized autonomy, although I remain profoundly critical of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. I opposed it strongly at the time, and I continue to think it was a terrible thing to have happened. But Iraqi Kurds now have formalized autonomy thanks to the great skill, I think, of the Kurdish leadership in Iraq. But I agree absolutely with David that the leaders have now shown that they're unworthy of the leadership that they offer. One needs a profound change of political style in Iraqi Kurdistan, and I'm afraid I don't see much possibility of that. I suppose one of the things that I think is really interesting is the emergence, and its thanks, I suppose, really mainly to the PKK and associated movements, but the emergence of the question of gender. And one wonders how far it is going to be successful. I would like to think that it will start to really change habits of thought in the region. But I think I have to be skeptical. I know, because I mean, I have lived in Britain through the most profound social change that has occurred in history. And it's a more profound social change that's happened at any other time I can think of, for the last 2,000 years in terms of social behavior. And yet there is an ongoing debate here and in the New World, the Me Too movement. Clearly, we have not achieved gender equality by a very long chalk. So if I'm thinking that about Western society, I have to be very, very cautious about how successful this challenge to gender inequality is in Kurdistan. But I'm optimistic, and I think simply to have the debate and for tertiary education now to be widely available to young Kurdish women has inevitably going to have a long-term impact. And I find that very exciting, and perhaps the most, exciting prospect that Kurds have. I think I ought to stop there. I shall start burbling if I go on.
Thank you. The next question probably both could answer, because this is an opinion question. It says, do you think Kurds can unify? What can be a triggering step for this unification among the Kurdish parties? Let's start with Professor Romano for this time.
It depends what we mean by unify. Like, I mean, let's look at the Arab world with the Arab Spring. The Arab world's divided into 22 states, and you know, the Pan-Arabist dream died sometime after 1967 and subsequent events, and it's as far from unity as possible. Yet there's a certain ethnic, national Arab regard for one another, that amongst the populations there's a certain unity. They have regard for each other. They see themselves as fellow Arabs. So if we mean something similar for the Kurds, I don't think most people would have any trouble seeing that Kurds from whatever part of Kurdistan have an affinity for one another that often supersedes or is greater than their affinity for co-citizens in their state that are not Kurdish. So they may meet in Baku or somewhere, and one is Zaza speaking from central Turkey, and the other is Haudami from the border of Iran and Iraq, and then they still have this affinity for themselves. Now, if we're talking political unity, no, I don't think that's something realistic. But as a Kurdish friend of mine told me a while ago, he said the Arabs have 22 states. Why can't we have more than one? And of course, he had a national perspective on the matter. But if we're talking about a kind of pan-Kurdish project, I don't see that as realistic.
Mr. McDowall, I think the unification among Kurdish parties, the implication underneath is so that they can create an independent, unified Kurdistan. How would you respond to the same question?
Well, I very much agree with David about political unity. I don't think there's any visible prospect of that. I mean, first of all, of course, the Kurds are in no control of achieving that. But even were they to do so, I mean, we've already got fundamental ideological divide between those who have affection for the teachings of Abdullah Öcalan and those who are more traditional in, say, Iraqi Kurdistan. And there you have a profound division which is based on kin loyalty. And if you ratchet back 26 years to 25 years to the civil conflict between the PUK and the KDP, the KDP felt sufficiently strongly about its own interests that it invited Saddam Hussein's forces in to assist it see off the PUK. Well, it does not strike me that that's a very promising basis for achieving greater political unity. And I'm afraid I'm not convinced that Kurdish parties would not in the future invite in a friendly government to help them against Kurds with whom they disapproved profoundly. I mean, this is in the nature of tribal or kin groups to put that loyalty framework at above that of a so-called national group. So I'm not at all optimistic. And the other thing I would point out is, I mean, I listened to Kurdish rhetoric on the hoped for unity of the Kurdish people. I hear it most loudly, I think, in the diaspora. And here again, I'm afraid I must disclose my slight cynicism that I noticed that certainly in London, Turkish and Kurds from Turkey and Kurds from Iraq tend not to mingle very much. And I think we have to face the fact that if you live in a state for long enough and you get your education courtesy of that state, and indeed a wider cultural atmosphere, then that does act as to separate you somewhat from Kurds who are living in another state. And I've heard Kurdish intellectuals say to me, the last thing I want is actually Kurdish independence, because I feel a bond with Tehran, with Iranian culture or Turkish culture or Arab culture, that actually having studied in Tehran or Baghdad or Ankara or Istanbul or somewhere like that, then you again, it's back to the question of identity, you have mixed feelings about what your identity is. And this seems to me particularly problematic for sub-state players in the region.
If I could jump in on that comment, there's this film that came out, I think it was in the late 90s, called, I believe the title was Le Mariage Kurde, about a Kurdish guy in the diaspora in France who has an arranged marriage with a woman from Kurdistan who comes to France to join him. And there's this scene in the movie where various political parties in the diaspora, in the Kurdish diaspora, are having a meeting to kind of consolidate their activities and create a joint platform. But the meeting never gets going because they can't agree which language to use in the meeting. The ones from Baku want to use Turkish, and then the others are saying they will not use the oppressor's language. And then very different dialects of Kurdish are suggested. Not all of them speak French because some of them have recently arrived. And I think it was a sad commentary to what political divisions for 80 plus, I guess, 100 years now have created. They create different cultures. They solidify the difference between the various Kurdistans, and even if there weren't the political divisions, those cultural and societal divisions can become acute when we're talking about a practical political project of unity, as opposed to just ethnic cultural affinity for one's brethren. Yeah, I guess that's what I wanted to add.
Next question actually makes an assumption. I don't know how you guys will react to it. It says, why Kurdish nationalism remains deeply underdeveloped? So the word underdeveloped is a question that I like to stress. In your opinion, do you think it is underdeveloped and structured as local autonomous movements? Is that because Kurds as a nation did not go through industrialization process? Because Ernest Gellner said that nationalism developed as a result of industrialization. So in your opinion, the failure to create a nation state for the Kurds, is it because Kurds did not go through industrialization process? And do you agree that Kurdish nationalism remains underdeveloped? Anyone can jump in.
David, I think you should go first this time.
I don't know if I'm comfortable with the underdeveloped thing. Like, I mean, moniker. I think there's plenty of evidence that Kurdish national sentiments came on the scene a bit later at the popular level than say Arab or Turkish or Persian nationalism. But I don't know what we mean by underdeveloped. And I'm not particularly wedded to Ernst Gellner's understanding of nationalism either.
Or let me put it this way, do you agree that if you fail to create a nation state, that is a judgment of your nationalism, underdevelopment of your nationalist.
Ah, okay. If by underdeveloped, we mean that without a nation state, the Kurds weren't able to create a unified language, which would act as a vehicle to further reinforce national sentiment and identity, then sure. But I think we need to acknowledge that in most of the MENA region, the state came first and the nation came second. Like, I mean, in all these states, they standardized languages with the power of the state and then use that to work on developing a national consciousness. And it seems like a very incomplete project still for many states that have enjoyed statehood for so long. Like, I mean, how many times have we heard the sayings like the problem with the Iraq is that there's no Iraqi nation or so on. And that's not just referring to Kurdish Arab divisions, but sentiments that prioritize Sunni or Shia identities or various tribal identities ahead of others. Or when we look at explanations of the Syrian civil war, it's because there aren't Syrians first and foremost. There's different sectarian and ethnic groups. So I guess I don't have a clear answer. Maybe David can help me out here, but I guess I would say let's at least compare the Kurds to other groups when we try to assess the level of development of their nationalism.
Yeah, I think that's the elephant in the room. The biggest question that people usually ask in general is that why Arabs created nation states at the end of World War I, but Kurds failed to do so. So what's wrong with the Kurds? Is it the problem of unification? Arabs did not have unification. So what are the underlying? But it's a very big question. I don't know if Mr. McDowall wants to take a bite of it.
Again, I mean, the first point to make, of course, is that the Arabs did not create their states. It was wicked, great powers like Britain that did so and drew the lines according to their own political interests. And I mean, I'm unhappy with the word undeveloped, because it kind of implies that nationalism should be developed, and it's a good thing. And I personally, I'm very skeptical. I mean, here I am, I'm British, I'm part Scots, I'm part English. I notice that the English tend to refer to the whole of Britain as England, which shows that even after 300 years of political union with Scotland, the English still haven't quite absorbed the fact, and many Scots find that quite irritating. So I don't really think I belong to a nation state, and indeed it's perfectly possible in the next few years that Scotland detaches itself because it feels it could manage better, but it doesn't. Scotland does not have, I don't want to get onto another country, but Scotland does not have a strong identity. It has a strong national identity, but I don't think it's strongly nationalistic. It thinks it can manage things better if it organizes itself. But to get back to Kurdistan, I mean, the critical thing is the great powers forged the boundaries of the Arab world. Britain and France came to individual agreements, or indeed disagreements, with Turkey over the border between Syria and Iraq and Turkey. I think all of you will know that the boundary between Iraq and Turkey was decided by the League of Nations award in 1926. But these are, I mean, I just feel we've been, human beings have been absolutely suckered by the West into believing that ethnic boundaries are a great idea. I personally feel very skeptical about them. I'm very uneasy about them. Inevitably, we have administrative boundaries, but we imbue them with a kind of sacred quality. You know, I mean, Jerusalem, the eternal capital. Oh, for goodness sake, you know, this is, it has a negative impact. It doesn't help, in my view. We need to be much more universal in our approach. And I think that when we come to Kurdistan, I mean, at the crucial moment when the great powers were drawing the lines, Kurds were still organized. First of all, they were overwhelmingly rural and did not have a strong urban and written culture, which put them on the back foot. Secondly, they were landlocked, which again is an enormous disadvantage. But thirdly, and perhaps overwhelmingly, they were still tribally organized. And of course, tribes, and I can then call in again my Scottish ancestry. I can say that however romantic Scottish clans seem to the outside world, actually they were a complete nightmare. They were dreadful, and they quarreled with each other. They were, most of their behavior was ruthless and barbaric. It was politically calculating, rather like the Barzanis calling in Saddam Hussein. Scottish clans would call in government troops against another clan. There was no solidarity. So when it came to trying to forge a nation in 1918, in the terms that the West was laying down for the region, clearly Kurdish society was very, very ill prepared for that, through no fault of their own, because there's nothing terrible about belonging to a tribe. But if you do belong to a tribe, then different rules apply, and they don't work very well in the environment of empires drawing up, turning the Middle East into nation states or trying to do so. So I just think that Kurds, on the one hand, were enormously disadvantaged a century ago. They've struggled to play the same game everyone else is playing in the Middle East of nation states. I'm terribly skeptical about the value of that. But where Kurds, the direction they should take, they have to work out themselves. And they obviously have to do that with a degree of realism. And I think that calls into question the matter of the independence referendum 4 years ago, which struck me as a big mistake. Even, I mean, I thought it was a big mistake before they attempted it. But Kurds have to be realistic about being landlocked and having to live with powerful neighbors. And they have to work out, I think, ways of living cooperatively and productively in that circumstance.
If I could just throw one little thing in, my colleague here at MSU in the history department, Jean Bajilan, he's published some articles, an article 2 years ago, giving a pretty straightforward answer to that question, which is that the Kurds just weren't able to convince the great powers to create them a state, and that was why their nationalism today isn't as advanced, because they didn't cajole the great powers back when the states were being created. I think that kind of begs the question of why they weren't in a position to cajole the great powers, whereas others were. Was it just bad luck, or was it who was better able to leverage their power and appear more organized vis-a-vis the great powers and so forth? But there are some answers quite similar to what David has just told us.
If I could just come in on that as well, David. I mean, in the archive, in the British National Archive, I came across correspondence which showed that Britain initially in 1917 through to 1920-21 were very anxious to find a Kurdish leader who would be able to coalesce the Kurdish tribes, not because obviously Britain thought it believed in a Kurdish state. I mean, Britain is a deeply, like all great powers, it's deeply cynical. It was acting in its own interests, but it thought it would be very useful to have a Kurdish polity to the north of Mesopotamia, which would keep the Turks away. And it was, Britain was completely, rather like France, enormously anxious about the prowess of the Turkish forces, particularly once the Turkish nationalist movement got going from 1919 onwards. Britain was very anxious about it. If they could have had a buffer state, they would have gone for it. But they interviewed any, Sheikh Taher of Shamdinan. They interviewed Simcoe of the Shikak. Again, and the Brits just thought, this guy's just not a runner. He's not going to be able to do it, and I don't. They didn't trust him, and of course Sheikh Mahmoud Bazinji had many Kurdish enemies locally around Soleimani. So let alone further north, where his authority, his spiritual authority, was not recognized since he was Qadri and not Naqshbandi. So I think that there were problems, and which explain why it never happened.
The next question is actually related to what I am about to say. It seems that we're doing discussions on seeing a creation of a nation state as the ultimate end of a group of peoples living in harmony and peace. I think that assumption, as David McDowall questioned, should be under close scrutiny. Is it necessary to have a nation state to live freely? Is creation of a nation state the ultimate end, or as Francis Fukuyama puts it, end of history? If we can go beyond that, then perhaps we can discuss, for example, is nationalism necessary for a creation of a state? Can you create a state without a nationalism? As speakers mentioned, that in many cases, especially in the Arab lands, there was no nationalism, but state was created for them. But the next question actually goes along this line, and it says that cultural atmosphere has been mentioned earlier. Leaving aside political unity, do you both think it is possible for the Kurds to create a supranational common cultural space through which they can live freely and express their identity? Is it necessary for the Kurds, in other words, to have a nation state or supranational structures they can live freely?
Should I go first?
Yeah, please.
Okay. I'm a little less, how shall I say, negative about nationalism than I think David is. The answer depends on the context. If you feel that the national group you identify with, if you feel your Kurds are discriminated against by Arab nationalists, Persian nationalists, Turkish nationalists, and targeted on the basis of them being Kurdish, I think it's perfectly reasonable to see you wanting a state where Kurds are the majority, so that they can find security and get out of that horrible situation. In some other context, that's not necessary, and we can talk about a more cosmopolitan kind of identity where nationalism isn't needed for succor or security. Maybe my own baggage as someone from Quebec plays a role. Like, I mean, I don't think Quebec is at risk or threatened by the rest of Canada by any means, but you know, that there was that in the history under British imperialism and so forth, and the threatened loss of French language and culture. And even today, in as serene and peaceful an environment as Canada is, many Quebecois feel that the sovereigntist cause is an important and necessary one for their own security, not in a physical sense, because it's very different than Kurdistan, but in a cultural, linguistic sense, where they need to be the majority and determining their future. And if many Kurds feel the same way, I'm not going to begrudge them that. If, on the other hand, that's impossible because of all the obstacles that David has clearly laid out here with us today and in his book as well, whether they be geographic or political or tribal divisions or what have you. If Kurdish statehood is impossible in that sense, and I'm talking a benign liberal statehood where other groups are considered Kurdistani. Notice it's the Kurdistan regional government, not the Kurdish regional government. I think the Kurds have been pretty good about being fairly liberal in their nationalism, having experienced being victims of non-liberal nationalisms. But even if that were, where was I going with this? It may not be possible, but I think it's completely understandable that they would aspire to it. If it's not possible, then perhaps they can at least develop their national identity and culture and sense of shared kinship at that supranational level, thanks to advances in technology and the internet, and started with satellite TVs like MedTV and others, and have that space and conversation to interact there, even after the borders have hardened post-World War I.
I'd like to jump in also to point out another assumption that we need to poke around, is that the identity is fixed. When we talk about Kurdish identity, I have done some work and some thinking about this and how it evolves into what it is today. And even today, the Kurdish identity, there is no fixed Kurdish identity among different groups. So that assumption also brings in a huge hole in creation of a unified Kurdish state. Before I give the last word to Mr. McDowall to respond to that, I'm sure he has something to say. Let me ask my last question, and then we will be out of time after that. That is not related to this, but more of a scholarship issue. I'm curious, as far as I see, that your first edition was somewhere between 1994, 95 till 2000. And then your fourth edition came 20 plus years later. What's the reason behind it? There are many very significant events took place during that time. Why did you take your sweet time to update that book? Thank you.
Thank you, Hakan. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I should say that if I'm jaundiced about nationalism, you have to understand that I am British, and I'm afraid that my English compatriots went for nationalism in 2016 and decided to leave the European Union. And I feel as strongly about being a European as I do about being British. And so you are looking at somebody who is filled with regret at the consequences of nationalism. One of the things, I think there are a variety of things, and you could put this in the European context, but I would put it in a Middle Eastern one. And that is that if I also strongly, I have to say, believe in cultural diversity and the encouragement of cultural diversity and the freedom. And there one can immediately criticize the governments of the region for being less than enthusiastic. But it seems to me that, and I've even 25 years ago, when torture in Turkey of people who claimed Kurdish identity was absolutely routine, I'm afraid I've always felt most optimistic about the future of Kurds in Turkey rather than in Iraq or elsewhere. And I think it's to do with the fact that if once Kemalism falls away, as I think it really is now falling away, if Kurds can get a productive relationship with their fellow citizens who are Turkish, and I deeply believe that's possible, then I think that they can create the space for cultural autonomy, assertion of cultural identity, while still working in a very productive political relationship with the rest of Turkey. It does not seem to me that that's impossible at all. And if I look at my own country, England and Scotland had a very productive relationship for 300 years, which is now actually in a process, I think, of disintegration, but for other reasons. So that is what I would hope for. And I think that if you're looking for a sense of Kurdish cultural and national identity, it is perhaps a global one, and it's much stronger in the diaspora than it is in the individual countries. I sense that it is in the diaspora that people think about these questions, they meet, and they come from different countries to talk about it. I'm talking about Kurds who are intellectuals there. I think there are a large number who come to, for example, Europe, who do not necessarily have these intellectual thoughts and don't necessarily feel strongly about being Kurdish, but the thinkers do, and they think hard and long about what binds them together, and indeed what the things that divide them, like whether they're Zazaki or Kamanji or Alevi or Sunni or Shii and so forth. Now, the $64,000 question, why there was such a long gap between the third edition and the fourth edition, I will be absolutely frank with you. I more or less felt I dealt with the phase of my life thinking about and writing about things in the Middle East. And in fact, in the last, since 1996, since my book on the Kurds first came out, I've devoted most of my time to researching British landscapes and writing guides to them, which I've self-published. So it has absolutely nothing to do with the Middle East. And the only part of the Middle East that I really followed closely was the question of Palestine, which for me is an affair of the heart, because it was the very first place in the Middle East in 1964 that I visited at the age of 19, and I was deeply impressionable. And even then, when it was the West Bank of Jordan, I felt that a profound injustice had been done, and I felt passionate about that ever since. So that is the only part of the Middle East I really kept closely in touch with. But I was asked to do it. In 2016, I was asked to update the book. I got deeply involved. I realized that what I thought would take 6 months was going to take an awful lot longer, because so much had taken place in the first 20 years of the 21st century. And I'm very glad I did it. And I found it a deeply rewarding exercise. And let me repeat that I am actually immensely indebted to all three, my host Gunesh and David and Hakan, for your work in helping me to update the book and also to revise it, in which I also again was indebted to you for the work that you've done previous in the 20th, about the 20th century, and indeed the 19th. And it certainly changed my thinking. I think I got one or two things very badly wrong in the first edition. I think I misread the Sheikh Ubaidallah uprising quite badly, and I've revised that. I also think I didn't appreciate the complexities of the Armenian question. And perhaps most important of all, I underestimated the enormous importance of economics in the whole fate of the Kurdish people. And Veli Yadergi's book is, of course, immensely important in that respect. So I'm indebted, of course, to him as well. So it's been a great exercise. I'm now keeping in close touch as I can with events in Kurdistan, because I don't, again, wish to shut the book on it.
Well, we thank you for taking your sweet time to write this wonderful update, and we're grateful for your effort. And I hope you won't stop and keep producing, not necessarily Kurds, but your viewpoints and Your understanding of that part of the world is very important. And I also thank you, David Romano, for this great contribution, and also Güneş Murat Tezcir for organizing this event. And I would like the best for everyone participated, ask questions, and hopefully our roads will cross in the future. Thank you again.